Hello and welcome to the third APLD webinar of 2017. Special thanks to our 2017 webinar committee chair, Robert Kazam, and our other webinar committee members. I'd also like to thank APLD's sponsors for their support of the organization. Our gold sponsors, Dynascape Software and Proven Winners Color Choice. Our silver sponsors, Bartlett Tree Experts, Campania International, and Vectorworks. Our bronze sponsors, Country Casual Teak, Garden Design Magazine, Hortica, Plant Development Services, Save a Tree, Shoot Limited, Shrub Hub, Site One Landscape Supplies, Top Level Design, and Walpole Outdoors. Please support our sponsors as they allow us to bring programs like this one to you at a very reasonable cost. If you are having difficulties hearing or viewing the webinar, please call the office at area code 717-238-9780 or send an email to eventspec, that's event, S-P-E-C, at apld.org. Bill will be pausing throughout the webinar to answer any questions regarding his presentation. To ask a question of the speaker, please click the speech bubble, type the question into the chat box that appears, then click send or press the enter key. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Bill Thomas. Bill arrived at the 48-acre garden Chanticleer on April Fool's Day, 2003. Previously, he was at Longwood Gardens for 26 years, the last 5 in research and production, prior 21 years in education. Bill leads the talented and creative Chanticleer staff in continued development of the young garden, now in its 24th year. He emphasizes an environmentally sensitive and multi-sensory approach to the property and is unifying the former estate into one cohesive garden. The staff and he co-authored Art of Gardening. Bill is chair of Greater Philadelphia Gardens, promoting the Philadelphia region as America's garden capital. He holds a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science in Ornamental Horticulture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the 2017 recipient of the Scott Medal and Award from the Scott Arboretum of Swarthmore College. Join Chanticleer's Executive Director and Head Gardener, Bill Thomas, for a visual and behind-the-scenes look at what the Washington Post calls one of the most interesting and edgy public gardens in America. Please welcome Bill.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. Chanticleer is a pleasure garden, and those two words sum up our goal. When you visit, we hope you leave in a better mood than when you have arrived. That's our very simple goal. We're located about 20 miles west of Philadelphia, and the garden itself is about 35 acres that are open to the public. The main path is just over a mile in length, so we're actually a relatively small garden. You could get around it quite easily in 20 minutes, but I hope when you visit you'll spend a couple of hours really enjoying the property. We own 48 acres total, and that includes 10 acres. It's a hayfield across the road from us that is meant to keep the area feeling somewhat rural. What I'm going to be doing is a visual or virtual walk through the garden. We'll be starting at the teacup garden at the entrance, going from the right-hand side of the screen to the left, and then coming back, ending up at the vegetable garden and cut flower garden. And I'll be talking about how we organize the garden, how we garden, and how we design as we're going through. Chanticleer was the home of the Rosengarten family. The Rosengardens had a pharmaceutical firm in Philadelphia that merged with Merck in the 1920s. Originally, the house was their country home or vacation house. They'd spend the weekends here and extended periods during the summer. In the 1920s, they added on to the house and moved to the area full time. This is Adolf Rosengarten Sr. and his wife Christine Rosengarten with two of their three grandchildren. The young man dancing with his grandmother is currently our president of the board, and the little girl sitting on her grandfather's lap is a board member. And here is their brother, the third grandchild, who is vice president of the board. The Rosengartens had two children, each of whom was given a house on the property as a wedding present. The son, Adolf Jr., and his wife, Janet, were given the house that was called the Minder House. It was in what is today's center of the property and is the site of the Ruin Garden. The house was, Adolf's house was taken down in 1999, and the Ruin, which is a folly, and I'll show pictures later of that, was built in 2000. Janet and Adolf Rosengarten are our founders. They loved the property, loved the garden, and wanted it to stay on after their deaths. Janet died in the early 1980s, and Adolf died in 1990, and when he died in 1990, he left the property to be a public garden, and we opened in 1993. Adolf Jr. had a sister, Emily Rosengarten, and she was given a house which is now at the entrance to the garden as her wedding present when she married in 1935. Notice the tree at the end of the house that looks like a nice small tree. That's actually a hybrid oak tree, Quercus solii, and this is what it looks like today. Magnificent specimen that you'll see soon after you enter the garden. And when Adolf died in 1990, the property was mainly big trees, big beautiful trees, and very attractive lawns. He did not restrict how the property would be developed, and since 1990, the property has developed greatly, and what we think of as the Chanticleer Garden is pretty much a contemporary garden within a historic setting. The first garden you come to is the Teacup Garden. This has seasonal displays. We change them twice yearly. We have a spring display, and then it's followed by a summer display. And you notice in this picture, much of the color comes from foliage. In this case, those are primarily lettuce plants, which of course do beautifully in our cool springs, and they are frost tolerant. And so throughout the garden, you'll see that we rely on foliage, color, and texture much more than we do flowers. Flowers are essentially accents. So those were some spring shots. Here's some summer shots in the garden, in the Teacup Garden. Again, relying on foliage with flowers as accents. The teacup gets its name from the fountain that's in the center. It's a fairly simple fountain that we think was purchased by the Rosengartens in the 1920s on a visit to Florence, Italy. Water flows off the edges into a saucer down below, giving it the name teacup. So you'll notice the spring displays change greatly from year to year, as do the summer displays. The designer of this area is the gardener or the horticulturist of the area. It's currently Dan Benarsic, and we have 5 horticulturists, each of whom is in charge of an area, and they are responsible for the design, planting, and maintaining of the area. And then I, as the head gardener and the director, try to make sure that the whole garden fits together as one, and that you can't tell when you're leaving one gardener's area and going into another. And this is what the teacup looks like this summer. Silvers and blues surrounding containers filled with aquatic plants. And then surrounding the teacup are planting beds as well as containers, and the containers complement the planting that is going on of the current summer. As we go further into the garden, we come to the tennis court garden. We're not terribly imaginative on how we name areas. This was originally a tennis court, and in 1990 it was one of the first areas to be changed as we prepared to become open to the public in 1993. So we still call it the tennis court garden. This one, unlike the teacup, which has changing displays and very little is permanent, most of the plants in the tennis court are permanent, and most of them are herbaceous perennials with some cutback shrubs and other shrubs in it, and then accents with annuals and bulbs in the planting. It's a little bit lower than where you entered, and so you come down these stone steps with sedum on the sides or on the railing. In this shot, there are alliums and camasias in bloom. This is another spring shot. And then in summer, it's a much taller display here with paths or ribbons of calamagrostis going through the tennis court, drawing, we hope, your eye through the area and tying it all together as one. As you go a little bit further into the garden, you come to the orchard lawn. Again, this was originally a working orchard with cherries and apple trees, and now planted with flowering cherries and ornamental crab apples. And in the lawn area, we have about 250,000 bulbs that have been planted. So early, we have Chinodoxa or Gloria of the Snow in bloom, as you see here. And then later followed by daffodils. And throughout the garden, we have furniture that has been made by staff. Everyone has a winter project, and that includes projects in our wood shop and our metal shop. So these are chairs made by one of the gardeners, lined up in the orchard, welcoming people to sit and enjoy the garden. At the top of the orchard is the Chanticleer house, pretty much in the center of the garden, and was the original house on the property. When you have bulbs in the lawn, you of course have to wait till the bulb foliage matures before you can mow it. In our area in southeastern Pennsylvania, the bulb foliage generally ripens in mid to late June, and that's when we can mow the grass. So until then, we have the grass grow long, but we cut pathways through it, giving us big beds of these long grasses, which I think are very ornamental. The mowing sets off these beds, but it also shows people that we haven't just forgotten it, that it isn't, we're not just being lazy, but we are actually purposefully not mowing this. And throughout the garden, we try to show people various ways of maintaining their own properties and their own gardens. And one of the things we'd like to show people is that they don't have to just mow lawns, that they can let grass grow long, they can have other types of lawn substitutes in there. So this gives people an example of what long grass can look like. Originally, the entrance area to the Chanticleer house was a big square paved area. When we were going to open it public, we redesigned it. We planted accolade cherries around a circle in the center, a circle of gravel. Under the cherries, we planted hydrangeas, hellebores, and lilies. The gravel in the center was not originally meant to be raked, but our very talented and creative staff couldn't stand having the gravel just sit there unraked and messy, and so we rake the gravel every day. Of course, when I say we, I'm not the one doing it, but whoever holds the rake gets to determine the design of the gravel. And we find that when we have students working here, they often are the ones that are eagerly asking if they can do the raking. And I insist that they meditate for at least 8 seconds before they do the raking. Probably the prettiest time in this area is when the cherry blossoms drop and they fill the grooves of the raked gravel, and the pattern is the most obvious at that point in time. And then later in the summer, which is right now, hydrangeas come into bloom. We've mixed in very fragrant lilies in the hydrangea planting to give both some added color and accents, but also great fragrance. So when you enter this courtyard, you're nearly overwhelmed with the fragrance of the lilies. As you walk around the Chanticleer house, you come to terraces, and this one terrace that we're looking at right now had originally been mowed turf, and for about 99 years it was mowed turf when the gardener in this area came up with the idea of doing something different, and he proposed planting about 5,000 bulbs in this area of tulips and daffodils. In the first year, we threw down wheat seed, and so we had a meadow-like planting when the bulbs bloomed. It was a bit of an experiment. We thought we might just rip the bulbs out and re-turf it, but people enjoyed it. And so what we did was we replaced the wheat with a more permanent planting of a fine fescue, a mixture of fine and sheep fescues, which matures at about 8 inches. And then we've planted annuals and perennials in it, and we're calling it our flowery lawn. I don't think of it as a true meadow, but a mixture of flowers and lawn. And then you notice we mow along the edge, so again, that tells people we haven't forgotten the area, and in my mind gives a very attractive frame to this flowery lawn. One of the things that I get a great delight out of is watching the pollinators that come to these flowers. And when you think of a regular lawn, there are very few pollinators that are being fed by a lawn. But in this area, we have butterflies, moths, bees, hummingbirds throughout the summer season. We also have seasonal display plantings there, and just as we saw in the teacup, we don't do big masses of plantings where you have a knockout display and then you have bare soil as you take out that display and put in another one. We like to do mixed plantings. So I thought I'd go through this bed. So you'll notice there's tulips in bloom, and then it's perhaps hard for you to see, but there's a curving band of carex, of sedge, and then lettuces, as well as wallflowers and digitalis and some other plants in there. As the tulips went down, we pulled the tulips out, leaving that band of sedge, as you can see, and the lettuces. And what we couldn't see in the other picture was that there were some purple-leaved mustards in there. The wallflowers continue blooming. So we were able to take out the tulips, and we still had a display that was attractive. And then when we went to plant the summer planting, the sedges were still good, and so the band of sedges going down the center remained. We took out the other plants and gradually put in these mixture of tropicals and non-hardy plants and some annuals in there. There's some fennel in there, giving it a very fine texture. So I like it very much that whenever someone comes to visit, I'm hoping that they will not see soil, but instead will see our displays. And then, of course, there are lots of containers, and there are some hanging baskets on these terraces. The hanging baskets were added about 12 years ago. We added frames to the house, which we thought looked almost like awnings coming out of the house, and the idea was to tie the house and the terrace together with these hanging baskets. Because it's a large terrace, we felt we needed big baskets, and we also have them kind of at eye level, and so the way the basket looks is very important. So you'll notice here we've planted the sides of the baskets. In this case, we lined the baskets with sphagnum moss, and then we just planted throughout the basket so you could have a full planting. What we did this year with the baskets was we lined the wire baskets with willow twigs that we cut from our own willows. They have very colorful bark, and so that gave us an attractive basket into which we planted. And then as the season goes on, the plants cover much of the basket, but when the basket is there, it's attractive because the willow is hiding the mechanics of the basket. Containers, throughout the garden where we use containers, we use a variety of containers and then a variety of the plantings in the container. And in this shot, we show railing by Joe Henderson, one of our gardeners who is a very fine artisan with metalwork as well as wood and enamel. So here are a couple of spring pots, one of violas or pansies and another of grape hyacinths. Then that same spot in the summer months with another planting. Other containers throughout, sometimes we use succulents, which have the great advantage of not needing much water, and in this case showing off foliage and foliage color and texture. Here is a mixture of plants in a container and then other containers nearby. Some tall blue containers that we're using this year with a mixture of plants in them. This is early in the summer with palm trees coming out the top. And then large agaves, which we put into our greenhouses for the winter and actually use a forklift to bring them out in the planting. Because the spines are, of course, a problem or a challenge to us. In the winter months, we save our wine corks, and we will put a cork on the end of each one, so they're safe. And then during display time, we cut off the spines of the ones that point out onto the walkway. You can see two roosters there, not a real good shot of them, but the way Chanticleer got its name was actually from a Thackeray novel from the mid-1800s, where the fictional Chanticleer estate in England was the most beautiful in the county, although the house was filled with children and it was mortgaged to the very castle windows. The Rosengardens liked that story. They liked Thackeray, so they named their place Chanticleer. But Chanticleer is also the name of a French rooster, and so we have roosters, lead roosters and stone roosters throughout the garden. Off the west end of the Chanticleer house is a sun porch. We have furniture there as well as plantings. We welcome our guests to sit down and feel like they're the guests of the Rosengardens. The garden is open just for them. So we try very hard to not feel institutional. We want you to feel as if you were visiting a private garden. And so I hope that you have that feeling as you walk through. But to me, the sun porch exemplifies that feeling. And from the west end of the terrace is a great overview of much of the garden. The property goes to the tree line. You can see there's an exciting change of grade. This is a fairly steep hill. We welcome you to roll down it when you're visiting, but it gives views and vistas, of course, are one of the things that make a garden and are extremely important at Chanticleer, and so this, I expect we will always remain open because this is such a strong view. Again, staff-made furniture in the picture. Steep hillsides, of course, are challenged, though, if you're trying to get up or down them, and for years, one of the walkways up and down the hill was not accessible. It was a very steep walkway and it had steps. We were challenged by that, and we finally came up with a design by local landscape architect Jonathan Alderson of a raised walkway using weathering steel, and then Jonathan Wright, who was the gardener at the time, did the planting. So this is a case where we brought in a landscape architect, told him that we wanted him to design the hardscaping, but we did not want him to do the planting design. So Alderson did a great job on the walkway. I think it's a beautiful design, curving. The highest point above the ground is about 8 feet, and it goes below grade in several spots. And then Jonathan Wright, our gardener, planted essentially what I think of as a manicured meadow. It's a perennial garden almost on the wild side that you walk throughout as you're going through the garden, and you're immersed in the planting. And we're open from April through October, and from April through October there is always something interesting to see. We wanted some shade, we wanted some trees, and we decided to go with quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides. And here you can see them. It's essentially an experiment to see how well they do in our heat and humidity. And then we planted Muhlenbergia capillaris muhly grass, which becomes a beautiful pinkish red in September. As you go down the hill, you come to the serpentine, getting its name from its curving beds. We always plant something agricultural in it. And so in this shot, those are kale plants. We had 3 different cultivars of kale with different foliage colors planted. Another year we did winter rye, and this is winter rye germinating. And this is what it looked like as it was maturing. And the planting in the back, the trees or the aerial hedge, those are ginkgos that we've essentially espaliered to be an aerial hedge in the back. And this is what it looked like this spring. We used lettuce. We had 7 different cultivars of lettuce planted in blocks in the serpentine, and now we have just planted summer squash in mounds. So when you come to visit this summer, you'll see summer squash. As you go a little bit further west in the garden and near the western edge of the garden, you come to the bulb meadow. This is a meadow on a hillside, and the major color of the planting comes from bulbs. And we have bulbs in bloom essentially from April through October. It begins with narcissus and tulips in bloom. It goes into Spanish bluebells with viburnums, big-headed viburnums in the background in bloom. You'll notice we've cut a grass path in it, so again it shows it's not abandoned and also welcomes people to walk up or walk down the meadow. And the last of the spring bloomers are Camasias, a double white Camasia, and that blooms in May. We then let the bulb foliage ripen. All of the bulbs on this hillside have foliage that comes out in the spring, and so we let it ripen. We usually mow this the end of June. I find the grass to be very attractive as it's maturing, and just as it's starting to lay down and be probably a little less attractive is the time that we're able to mow it. And then just now, the beginning of August, end of July, beginning of August, surprise lilies, Lycoris scrobnigera, come up. And then at the end of September, the end of August, going into September, colchicums come into bloom, and those remain in bloom in September and October. And then that's the end of the season, and we mow again at that point in time. Just down the hill from the bulb meadow is Asian woods. This was originally a weedy woodlot that we took out the weedy invasives on the understory and planted with herbaceous and small trees and shrubs, plants from Korea, Japan, and China. And we've called it Asian woods. So it's a woodland garden using Asian plants. The big trees are all American natives. There are some primulas and trilliums in bloom. But much of the plantings, again, rely on foliage, color, and texture. We did a restroom in the area. We wanted to go with the Asian theme, so we sent 2 staff members to Japan to look at architecture and gardens. They came back and they helped us design what I'd like to call our Japanese pea house. And right next to the restroom is a grove of bamboo, and it spreads just like you'd expect bamboo to spread, but it's also quite beautiful. So we keep it in bounds by cutting it down and sometimes by digging it out. And we find lots of uses for it. One of the things is in Asian woods, we split the bamboo and use it as edging in on the secondary paths. Here's what which I think fits very nicely, and it also, because it's flexible, it curves quite beautifully with the paths. We also split them and use them as hoops. And these are very useful as indicators of where we don't want people to walk or where we want a bed to end and where mowers can go. So we use these wherever we need temporary fencing. Right next to Asian woods, so as you're coming out of the trees, you come to the pond garden, a big open area with 5 ponds. The original pond is large and has lotuses in it. It was built in the 1970s in a wet area, the natural springs, and then water is siphoned in from the nearby creek. And then there are 4 other ponds where water is circulated from that bottom pond up to the top and then recirculated back. Right now, the lotuses are in full bloom and quite gorgeous. The pond garden is surrounded by a very exuberant perennial garden, almost meadow-like, and lots of color throughout the season and lots of foliage contrast. And you see the Chanticleer house up at the top of the hill. The area is a favorite for birds, and we have a great blue heron who comes almost every day to fish in the ponds. And fortunately, we have enough fish that there is enough food for the heron as well as for keeping the fish alive in the garden. And here's a view of one of the upper ponds looking to the arbor. There is an arbor that overlooks the pond, and it's a comfortable shaded area throughout the summer, but in spring it becomes spectacular with wisteria in bloom. And this is the cultivar Shiro Noda, which I learned originally as Longissima alba. So it's a white blooming Japanese wisteria with extremely long blossoms. This is not a plant you want to use in a small garden, or actually most of the time you probably don't want to use Japanese wisteria, but because we've got a big arbor here, we've used massive white oak beams as well as stone uprights, we're able to maintain it. But this is a plant that is pretty wild in most gardens. And again, furniture by one of the gardeners under the arbor. Connecting the pond garden to the gravel garden, which is right above it, is the rock ledge. And this is a walkway going through this flower bed. In the photo, there are poppies in full bloom. And so you switch back going up the hill or coming down the hill, and you come to the gravel garden. The gravel garden is a southwest-facing hillside. It's naturally dry. We've added gravel to it to make it drain even better. We found that plants such as the Yucca rostrata in the middle of the photo is hardy for us, and it does not do well in our area if it grows in soils, if it's planted in soils that do not drain well. So we're able to get by with some marginal plants, Mediterranean garden effect, and then we also plant in some succulents, some tender succulents such as this Pachypodium, the upright plant in the center, and this is a plant that's alive again with color and texture throughout the spring, summer, and autumn months. And then there's stone furniture nearby with a gravel circle in front of it that we've planted with a number of silver plants, silver leaf plants, including the orange flowered Glossium that's in the center of the picture. And in the background you can see the ruin, which was built on the site of Adolph Rosengarten Jr.'s home. The house was taken down, and then the ruin was built as a folly to look like the house had fallen into disrepair, which it never did. When you go through the ruin, there are great plays on indoor-outdoor relationships. You look out windows, and you can really think about how the outdoor garden relates to, in this case, the indoor garden. Looking out here onto weeping Norway spruces. And then there are faces done by California artist Marcia Donahue in what I call the hot tub, although the water is not hot, but it's an area with fountains and water flowing. And in the center of the ruin is a table that could be thought of as a sarcophagus or a dining table. A sarcophagus symbolic of death, dining table symbolic of life, and the ruin really does play on themes of life and death in the garden. If you think of it, plants live, they grow, they then die, they become compost for the next generation of plants. And the green plant on the upper left-hand side of the screen is the David maple that's been espalier on the wall. Just outside the ruin is a meadow of Sporobolus, prairie dropseed grass. We've treated it as primarily a monoculture with dotting in a few other plants. So in the foreground, verbascum, there are Japanese maples and the weeping spruces. We bring in the Radnor Fire Company every March. Our local township fire company does a training exercise in this late winter, burning the meadow for us. And in the background, you can see the ruin. And then in the spring, the blackened mounds start sending up green shoots. By May, this is the textural effect of the prairie dropseed grass, and then in midsummer, it almost is wave-like. This mounding, clumping grass totally fills the area, and right now it's in full bloom, the blossoms are attractive, and they also smell a bit like cilantro-flavored popcorn. We have a creek that runs the entire length of the property, coming in from the east side of the garden, going out the west end by Asian Woods. In the center, we have what we call the Creek Garden, which is lined with Camasias, Blue Danube, that in mid-May are in full bloom, and the creek then becomes just a sea of blue. The rest of the season, it's more quiet with cut grass. There's a water wheel that originally pumped water up to fountains at the main house. And there is a round pool nearby with a toad fountain. The toad was carved by one of our staff members, and it is a gravity flow fountain that feeds water from the creek into the pond and then back into the creek. The upper part of the creek area is Bell's Woodland. That's our newest garden area. It's a native woodland garden featuring plants native east of the Mississippi, native to North America east of the Mississippi. Here's a spring shot. There's a wheelchair accessible path that goes through it that is made with shredded tires, recycled shredded tires that are bound with a permeable binder so water goes right through it. Gives a spring to your step as you're walking through it. And in one spot in the upper part of the garden, the path goes in a circle, and it goes around a circle with this beautiful rock, a big white oak, and it's been planted with trilliums. And then following the trilliums, in June, Spigelia marilandica comes into bloom, filling that space quite beautifully and gives us foliage the rest of the season, whereas the trilliums will have already gone dormant. There's a secondary path, which is a stone path that goes much closer to the creek and is a fun one to walk on and takes you through the trees and along the creek. And then, because you are near a creek, you come to this bridge built to look like a fallen tree, designed and built by the gardener in the area, Przemek Walczak. And this is the tree trunk that you walk through. Before we move on to the vegetable garden, Jamie we've received at least one question, so why don't we go with that now?
Yes, we have a question from Robert Kazan. What happens if you don't burn off the meadow? Does it fail, meaning other species grow into it like trees, etc.?
Very good question. The question about do we have to burn the prairie dropseed meadow? It has to be maintained in some way. Before we started mowing it, before we started burning it, and we've been burning for probably the last 8 winters, we mowed it. We took in heavy-duty lawnmowers and mowed the clumps of grass. That plus some hand weeding keeps all weeds down. With the burning essentially makes it that we don't have to cut it down, and that makes the whole thing just neater. Because we keep it weed-free, the burning is really not taking care of weeds at all because we're pulling those before they get to that point. If you were letting it to be much more of a natural meadow, yes, the burning would help get rid of some weeds. Although burning just once a year without any maintenance, you probably would, in this area, you would get woody plants coming in. Any other questions, Jamie?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, we'll keep moving on then.
Thank you.
So just across the creek from Bell's Woodlands Bridge is the vegetable garden. You'll notice there's a fence around it that helps keep out some of the rodents and the bunny rabbits. There's a wire fence on that wooden fence. Around all of Chanticleer, around the 35-acre garden, is a deer fence that is effective in keeping out deer. Otherwise, we would not be able to do what we grow if we had the high deer population let into the garden. We do eat from the garden. We pick 2 times a week. We share those harvests with our staff, and we also share with the nearby shelter. We try, first of all, to have the garden be productive, but also attractive. And a bench, sometimes in the vegetable garden or else nearby, is one made by staff with a vegetable motif. Tying the vegetable garden and to the nearby cut flower garden is a hedge of asparagus that in the spring is not a very useful hedge in terms of screening or in defining space, but it is a very delicious hedge. And then later in the summer, it actually does provide some screening and gives a feeling of enclosure to the cut flower garden, from which we actually do cut flowers for arrangements at our front desk, in our restrooms, and in the Chanticleer house, which is open for tours. And here's a shot of flower arrangements in the Chanticleer house and in one of our restrooms. Instead of labeling every plant, we have over 5,000 different types of plants in the garden, and we feel that if we labeled everything, you would see labels rather than seeing plants. And so instead of labeling everything, we have plant lists throughout the garden in individually made plant list boxes made by staff members. We include photographs of what we think will be most asked about, and then we have maps of the area with the entire plant list in it. We also have these lists available online, and so people are welcome to look at them online and research plants that they've seen in the garden. Everyone who's a full-time employee, and we have 20 full-time employees, has a winter project. 14 of the full-time staff actually work in the garden, and so they need indoor projects in the winter months, many of which are done in the wood shop, metal shop, and our stone shop. Here's Joe Henderson, the pond gardener, making one of our railings, which he did in the metal shop. Dan Benarsik using white oak from a tree that died on our property to make a large picnic table that's in the garden. Lisa Roper used Osage orange wood to make this bench in Asian woods. More chairs in the garden. We find that kids especially like going from chair to chair, exploring all the different types of chairs, different colors of chairs that we have in the garden. Adults also appreciate having a place to sit down. Here's a bridge made by one of the gardeners. Another bridge made by Sherman Welchek. The apple house, which originally stored apples from the orchard, is in the middle of the elevated walkway area, and one of the gardeners painted a mural inside that. 3 of our 4 drinking fountains have been made by staff. This one, a white oak leaf by the ruin. We have a number of tender plants that we have to overwinter, and so a few years ago we built 2 insulated greenhouses where we overwinter the plants. They're not display houses, but we fill them pretty much to the vents with plants, overwinter them, and then gradually bring them out in the spring. We have solar panels. This set of solar panels are on our equipment maintenance garage, and they produce about 18% of our total electrical usage. We, of course, compost. These are our compost bins, and we recently upgraded them. We put in pipes at the bottom of them that pump air into the compost, speeding up the decomposition of the material. We're continually trying to improve our environmental effect, and we have some paving areas. We have a large parking lot. We're also surrounded by paving, by roads on 3 sides of the property. So a lot of water comes into the property. We're currently capturing about 50,000 gallons at a time. We have storage capacity of 50,000 gallons, and that we then later use for rainwater. We also have basins that capture water that is coming in. These are just off Church Road, which is our entrance road. Capture water above the serpentine, allowing the water to soak in. The basins can hold the equivalent amount of rain, about 1.5 inches rain, before they overflow, and then the water just slowly sinks in to the ground, recharging our groundwater. We do have a large number of lawn areas, and lawn is a very useful, very attractive aspect, but it requires a lot of fuel to take care of, and also compact soil. So we're experimenting with alternatives. So here is a carex bed or a sedge bed that we've done that's near the serpentine that shows the effect of lawn, kind of rough lawn in this case, that only we mow it once a year just to keep it looking neat, but I think gives a very attractive textural effect similar to lawns. Some of our paving, we're trying to look at different ways of doing paving. So here's a service road that we put down permeable paving, and then in the middle, instead we don't drive down the middle of the service path, so we did a planting strip in which we planted liriape. We used liriape because it was such a tough plant. One could easily use sedges or grasses in such a planting. Here's an area where we had an old service road that we didn't want to dig up at this point in time, but to make it a little bit more permeable, we cut out the center strip of it and then again planted liriape in it. We're using mixtures of fine and sheep fescues in some areas, such as the flowery lawn by the Chanticleer house and here in the under metasequoias near our entrance. The garden is what it is because we've got a very talented staff. The 5 horticulturists are responsible for designing, planting, and maintaining their areas. We have assistant horticulturists who rotate around the garden with them, and we have interns. The staff is so talented that they wrote a book about how they design and they garden. It's a Timber Press book called The Art of Gardening. We have interns every year. This year we have 6 interns working in the garden, and they work alongside our staff. And because the gardeners are also designers, the students are working working right alongside the people who designed the garden, planted it, and maintain it. And so they're sometimes planting, definitely maintaining these plants alongside the designer. We support an American student to spend 11 months every year at Great Dixter, and then that individual spends a minimum of a month and sometimes up to a year with us at Chanticleer, either before or after the time at Great Dixter in England. We also welcome guest gardeners, professional horticulturists from across the United States or elsewhere. This young man was from Stellenbosch in South Africa, the Stellenbosch Botanic Garden, and worked with us. We have another one from Stellenbosch with us right now. So we welcome guest gardeners to work alongside our staff. Philadelphia is America's garden capital. There are more public gardens in the Philadelphia area than anywhere else on the continent. We have more than 30 gardens within 30 miles of Philadelphia. Chanticleer is open Wednesday to Sunday, from April through October. We're open 10 to 5. Friday nights during the summer months, we're open until 8 p.m. And on those Friday nights, we welcome people to picnic wherever they would like to, wherever in the garden they would like to picnic. It's a great place to bring a date, so give it a thought. Garden and landscape professionals receive free admission, so be sure to introduce yourself when you arrive at our front desk. The photographs in the talk were by Rob Cardillo and Lisa Roper. Lisa is on our staff, and Rob Cardillo did the photography for the Art of Gardening book. So I invite you all to come visit. It's a great place to study plants, to study design, and also just to have a pleasurable time. If there are any questions, we will take them, and I think there is at least one. Jamie?
Yes, so our question is, do you use Carex Pennsylvania in the full sun successfully as it appears?
That was a very sharp question, noticing that some of our Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica, growing in full sun, it does all right in full sun. It would grow best in light shade, and some of our planting is in light shade, and that does better. It stays greener. We do get some brown tips on it, especially when the bed gets dry. I would say yes, it can be grown in full sun, but it would be better in light shade. I think of our garden as a research garden, and we had not grown much of Carex pennsylvanica before we planted that bed, and so we planted it and then saw how it did. And so it does all right, but it's not perfect in full sun. Any other questions for us, Jamie?
Not at this time.
So again, Chanticleer is a public garden. We're open April through October. We're located 20 miles west of Philadelphia. We're essentially between Philadelphia and Longwood Gardens. So I hope you'll come visit us.
Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our attendees. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you have any further questions for Bill, please feel free to email me at eventspec@aplz.org, and I will forward them to Bill. For our attendees, please note that within the next 7 to 10 days, you will receive an email with a link and instructions on how to download a copy of the webinar file. Please be sure to check your spam folder, as our emails can sometimes end up there. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.